I want to talk about maybe the most profitable line in all of live poker. If you're not doing this 3, 4, 5 times a session, well, let's add a couple big blinds an hour to your win rate today. Let's talk about the c-bet flop, check back turn, bluff catch river line, and why it is so good. All right, so we are playing 2-5, 1K effective with the villain here. Villain's gonna open up the cutoff, and as you know, I like to play 3-bet or fold when recreational players open. The only time I'm really flatting in live poker is when a very strong pro opens and there's fish behind, or when I'm in the big blind closing the action. So I'm gonna put in a 3-bet here, and the villain is going to call. We're going to a flop, Jack 9 deuce with a couple of spades. Very special flop, a very special flop in my heart. Villain is going to check it over, and in 3-bet pots, in single raise pots, in any heads up pot, I am range betting in position because this is where live players make the most mistakes. When you're in position and you range bet, going to be very hard to play against. And in general, I like to choose a size where they raise off their strong shit and still call with their weak shit. So in single raise pots, usually around half pot gets that job done. In 3-bet pots, I like to go a little bit smaller because the absolute size of the pot is a little bit bigger. So usually around 30 to 40% pot with my entire range here. That's what I do. I go 50 into 147 and villain calls. We go to a turn, which is a 4 of hearts. He checks it over. At this point, I think we've got plenty of showdown value here. Our hand is probably too thin to bet for 3 streets, so I am going to check it back. Now, the river is the innocuous 3 of clubs, and I'm gonna show you 3 different scenarios on the river. Number 1, when villain comes out and bets half pot here. Number 2, when villain comes out and bets full pot here. And finally, number 3, when villain checks on this river. So 3 different scenarios. Let's talk about how to play all 3 right now, and I'm gonna show you why this line is so profitable. All right, first, let's talk about when villain comes out and bets half pot on this river. Number 1, when we 3-bet pre-flop, do you think villains call too much or fold too much? Well, in live poker, they probably call a little bit too much. They get to the flop a little bit too wide. Now, when we c-bet small on the flop, do you think they raise off too much of their strong stuff, or do you think they trap too much? I would say when we choose a small size on the flop, particularly on a wet dynamic board such as this one, villains in general are going to raise off too much of their strong stuff. When they just call on the flop, now the turn goes check, they're calling too wide pre-flop, they're calling too much of their weak stuff on the flop, they're raising too much of their strong stuff on the flop. They just have too much air. They have too many draws at bricked. The nice thing is when they get to this river, you've heard me talk about this before, fear and greed drives live players' decisions so much. And when they get to this river with a very strong hand, like ace jack or pocket queens or something like that, they're just going to come out and choose a bigger size. When villain bets half pot on the river, this is supposed to be our continue range. As you see here, ace 9 is just going to be a pure continue. We're calling with ace 9 of hearts, any ace 9 actually, 100% of the time here on this river. But now I want to go through, and as we like to do, I like to make a few node locks here and change villain's response. So let's look at ace 9 on this river. We are winning $233 when we call with ace 9 on this river. So already a very profitable bluff catch. But let's go through a node lock. I'm going to show you why in actuality in live poker in the real world, it's actually a more profitable bluff catch than in equilibrium. So let's go through and let's start with the flop here. And this is supposed to be villain's response when we bet $50 into 147 on the flop. If we lock ourselves to be range betting, they're supposed to be raising quite a bit, right? They're supposed to be raising like 20% of hands. I would argue this doesn't happen. So let's go through and let's make a few adjustments. So we would go to set strategy and node lock. Let's go through and let's look how villain's playing their range. First of all, let's go through and look how they're playing their flush draws. I would argue that they are not playing flush draws this aggressively. So we'll have them play flush draws just a little bit more passively. Now let's look at the open end straight draws here and let's see how aggressively they're playing these. Again, I would argue they're not going to play these this aggressively. Let's go through and look at the 4-out straight draws. Again, there's just no way they're playing 4-out straight draws this aggressively, so let's turn that down. Let's look at combo draws. This actually looks good. So they're going to be playing combo draws pretty aggressively. I think we can agree that is realistic. Let's look at the sets. And I would argue that sets probably play just a little bit more aggressively here. So let's just be conservative. Let's turn this up just a little bit. And then finally, let's look at 2-pair, how they're playing 2-pair here. And actually, I would argue that 2-pair maybe traps a little bit more than this. They're still going to play 2-pair very aggressively, maybe raising 80% of the time. But I would argue sometimes they just call with a hand like Jack 9 suited or something like that. Finally, let's look at these pocket pairs down here. These 4s, these 3s, these hands are just never raising in a 3-bet pot. And let's look at these ace king off, ace queen off hands. Again, these hands are just never raising. All we really did here is we turned down their frequency of bluff raising on the flop, and overall their 2-pair sets are still fast playing at about the same amount in equilibrium. So those are all the changes we made here on the flop. Let's go through and we are going to lock this and save and close. We will go back to our post-flop tree builder and we will click go and we will wait for this to solve. All right, if you remember before in Equilibrium, our ace-9 of hearts was printing $233.48 here. You can see right here by calling on this river in Equilibrium, we are winning $233.48. So now let's see, just by locking their flop response and having them play a little bit less aggressively with their draws on the flop, now let's see how much we're winning with ace-9 of hearts on this river. Look at that sweet baby there. We are winning over $60 more on this river just by having them play their draws a little bit more passively on the flop, because when they get to this river now, they just have too many draws, right? They just have too many draws that bricked. They just have too many floats that bricked, which forces them to bluff more. And when they get to this river with a lot of their busted draws, when they get here with air, when they get here with nothing, they're just not going to be using the big size all the time. They're going to be much more weighted towards the small size. And when they get here with very strong hands, I would argue they're probably going to be a little bit more weighted to the big size. So let's go through and let's node lock and see how this affects our bluff catching profitability on this river. All right, so here's what they are supposed to do on Equilibrium on the river. Getting here with this range that we locked on the flop, they're supposed to be using this big size on the river, this pot size about 21% and this small size about 19%. So let's go through and lock this. Let's see how they're playing. Let's make a few tiny tweaks. So we will go to set strategy and node lock here. If they did just call with a set on the flop, like pocket jacks or pocket nines, which they are doing sometimes, maybe 20% of the time, what size are they using on this river? Well, I would argue this is not accurate. They're not going to check the river again. They're not going to use a small size on the river with a set once the turn goes check, check in a 3-bet pot. I would argue players just get a little bit more greedy. They're going to use the big size just a little bit more. So let's shift that over to the big size a little bit more. Let's look at 2-pair here. 2-pair, again, I would argue the big size is just going to be used more than the small size. Now let's look what happens when they get here with nothing, when they get here with a brick draw. And I would argue that the small size is probably going to be used a little bit more than the big size here when they get here with a bricked draw. The co-founder of Hungry Horse Poker, my good friend Gethen Jacobs, high stakes online crusher for a long time, he said if he just folded every single time a recreational player bet greater than 3/4 pot on the river, he would have so much more money today. Because in general, when they use the big size, they just don't have enough bluffs in the big size. So you see, we haven't gone crazy here. We've just made sure that when they have nothing going to the river, they just use the small size a little bit more. And when they have 2-pair and sets going to the river, they use the big size a little bit more. Finally, let's check out what they're doing with a hand like top pair. They're using the big size more than the small size, which I think is fine here. And let's go through and lock this river. We will save and close, go back to our post-flop tree builder. We will click go, and then we will show you the results. All right, so here is Equilibrium. As you remember, when they bet half pot on this river, we are calling about 45% of the time, and ace-9 of hearts is winning $233 on this river by calling. And here is our strategy after doing just a little bit of node locking. Look at this. We are now calling nearly 60% of the time. Ace-9 of hearts is now winning $320 by calling on the river. So almost $90 more than we were winning in Equilibrium. As you can see, we're just not folding here. We're folding 8% of our range on this river when they bet half pot. You can see things are starting to get a little bit wonky here. It's starting to raise ace-9 and turn it into a bluff sometimes. I would not necessarily recommend that. We have not locked their response for when we raise. I would argue when we raise this river, they're probably going to be massively underfolding if they do occasionally have a top pair, 2-pair. If you don't believe the node lock strategy necessarily applies in your game, well, still, it doesn't matter. We were already printing on this river by calling when they bet half pot. Now we are printing even more. All right, next, I very quickly want to take a look at what happens when they come out and bet pot on this river. What should we be doing with our bluff catchers when they bet full pot on this river after the turn goes check, check? We see here in Equilibrium, when they bet pot on the river, of course, we're doing a lot more folding, which makes sense. Ace-9 still a profitable bluff catcher here on this river. We are winning $15 by calling on this river. So it's closer to break even, but we're still printing by calling with a hand like ace-9 of hearts in Equilibrium on this river. Let's look at the node lock solution now and see if ace-9 of hearts is still a profitable bluff catch when they bet pot. Here is the node lock solution when they come out and bet pot on this river. And as you can see, we are folding 84% of the time. We're just almost never calling getting to this river. And ace-9 of hearts is actually losing $32 when they bet pot. I would put my life savings on it that live players in general as a pool, when they bet pot on the river, they are under bluffing. The larger the size you're betting, the more bluffs you need to have. And I would argue that it's actually the opposite for live players. When they choose the smaller size, they just have too many bluffs. And when they choose the bigger size, they actually have less bluffs as a proportion of their range, even though they're actually supposed to have more. If someone is under bluffing, every bluff catcher is more profitable as a fold than as a call. All right, finally, and what do we do on this river when they check to us when we have ace-9 of hearts? We see here, here's our strategy in equilibrium. Ace-9 of hearts is just a very profitable 2/3 pot size bet here on this river. When we bet 163, we're winning the most money. We're winning about $215 by betting on this river once our opponent checks over to us. And here is the node lock strategy. Ace-9 of hearts now winning $236 when we bet 2/3 pot on this river. And I would argue, because we haven't even locked this yet, I would argue that it's going to be more profitable. So let's see what they're supposed to do here when we bet 2/3 pot on this river. And let's go through set strategy and lock node. Let's look at their range here when we bet 2/3 pot. So let's see what are they doing with top pair. Top pair is not going to be raising on this river. These guys are just checking to check call. I would argue they're calling it 100% frequency. Let's look what they're doing with second pair here, and second pair calling at 100%. That seems good. Now they have some of these bluff raises like pocket fives here on this river. I would argue this hand just does not get bluff raised. Let's just turn this frequency all the way down to 0, and they're probably just calling more here on this river when they get here with pocket fives. All right, so just a couple of tiny tweaks. We're going to lock this, save and close. Back to our post-flop tree builder, we will click go. It should solve very, very quickly here. And now we see when they check here on this river by betting 2/3 pot with ace-9 of hearts, we are winning nearly $259 here on this river. The turn goes check, check, and they come out and bet half pot on the river. We just essentially call with our entire range. When the turn goes check, check, and they come out and bet pot on the river, we just essentially fold our entire range. And when the turn goes check, check, and they come out and check the river, well, now we just get to value bet quite thinly on this river, because we know in general, if they had top pair, if they had an overpair, if they had a set, they would just most likely come out and bet the river. So now we just get to value bet with impunity. So no matter what happens, we have a very easy profitable decision. Hey guys, I'm Marc Goone. I've won over 7 figures playing poker. Wow. And I make these videos to help you guys win more so you can climb past low stakes and hopefully one day join us at Hungry Horse, where we can help you crush mid to high stakes and beyond. So if you're enjoying the video, if you're getting value out of this, all I ask, please hit that subscribe button. Thank you guys. Have a gentle day. All right, now I want to talk about a few mistakes people make in these nodes. I was making these mistakes myself, and once I patched these mistakes in my game, I started making a lot more money. Mistake number 1, checking back the flop with showdown value. A simplified strategy executed well is almost always going to outperform a more complex strategy. If we have some bets and some checks on this flop, in general, we're just going to have a more complex strategy. So let me talk about why that is not great. Because on this flop, our very strong hands, when we're this deep on a wet dynamic board in a 3-bet pot, all of our good hands want to bet. If we have an overpair, if we have Jack X, if we have a set, all of our value hands at 200 plus big blinds deep are going to want to bet when we are in position. If we have air or we have a draw, all of those hands are also going to want to bet when we are this deep and we are in position. So our value wants to bet, our air wants to bet. So it's probably just better here to simplify and bet our thin value and showdown value as well, and just have a very simple strategy of betting our entire range. Why is c-betting our entire range so good against live players? They call too much with their weak stuff and raise too much with their strong stuff, which just allows us to play very profitably against them, because they essentially play face up against range bets. Playing against range bets is very hard. Don't overthink it. Don't overcomplicate your strategy. Just range bet all of your hands in a 3-bet pot heads up in position in this spot. The second mistake people make in this spot is continuing to bet on the turn when they have a showdown value hand. So when they have a hand like ace-9 of hearts here, just continuing to monkey bet and barrel on this turn. Listen, I'm a big fan of playing very aggressively, but one of the mistakes we saw with our horses when we first started having them implement the Hungry Horse strategy is they would just barrel without any regard for what their hand strength actually is. So one of the things I'd advise on this turn is take a step back and actually classify your hand strength. And if you do have a hand that classifies as showdown value on this turn, checking back is going to be so much more profitable than continuing to barrel. So if we have a hand like 8-9 on this turn, what happens if we continue to barrel? Well, we get called by a ton of hands that are just beating us, right? We get called by all the Jack X, we get called by pocket 10s, we get called by overpairs, we get called by the better 9X, and of course, we're still getting value against the draws, but we're just getting value owned so often. But let's think about what happens if we check back this turn with our showdown showdown value. Well, now on the river, with hands that beat us, they generally just come out and choose a big size, so we lose 0 more money to those hands. And with their draws on the river, what happens is they come out and bet the medium size or the small size, so we end up winning 2 streets versus all of their draws and all of their bluffs, and we end up only losing 1 street against their top pair or their over pairs or their traps on the flop by checking back this turn. Mistake number 3, checking back the turn with hands that don't have showdown value. So if we do get to this turn with a hand like Queen 10 of clubs or something like that, Queen high, we want to continue barreling all the time. Why is barreling when deep in position against live players so profitable? Well, precisely because when we range bet the flop, they tend to call with too much weak stuff and raise too much strong stuff. So once we have bet small on the flop, they're just getting to the turn with a range that is too weak and too capped and just isn't going to hang on for 3 streets. So all of our air, all of our bluffs, all of that stuff wants to continue betting on the turn to make them play for all of the money when they have a hand like pocket 10s or 9x, even a hand like Jack 10 suited or Queen Jack suited that's going to call the turn and then fold the river when we put in all the money. Mistake number 4, very quickly, would be just calling the river whenever they bet pot. When they choose a size on the river, remember they are massively under bluffing, and every bluff catcher is more profitable as a fold than as a call if they are under bluffing. And finally, mistake number 5 would be folding whenever they bet half pot or 60% or 40% pot on this river. Anything under 2/3 pot, if we get to this river, we should be calling, remember, because we shouldn't be getting to this river with any hands that don't have showdown value. All of our air on the turn, all of our draws on the turn should just be continuing to barrel all of the time. So when we get to this river in this node, we should probably just be calling nearly 100% when they bet half pot, because we're only getting here with hands with showdown value. And when they are over bluffing, every single bluff catcher is more profitable as a call than as a fold. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video on maybe the most profitable line in all of live poker. I hope this levels up your win rate and turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys, and have a gentle day.